On the morning of January 13th, 1842, a lone figure appeared at the gates of the British garrison in Jalalabad. He was riding a dying horse. His uniform was in rags. His hands were frostbitten, his face half frozen, his body covered in wounds from bullets and blades. The sentries who saw him approach thought he was a ghost. His name was Dr. William Brydon, Assistant Surgeon, Bengal Army, British East India Company. The garrison commander rode out to meet him. He looked at the broken man on the broken horse and asked the question that every British officer in Afghanistan was dreading. Where is the army? Brydon looked back at the mountain passes behind him. Empty. Snow. Silence. I am the army, he said. 16,500 soldiers, officers, wives, children, servants, and camp followers had marched out of Kabul exactly 1 week earlier. They had been promised safe passage. They had been given guarantees by Afghan tribal leaders. They had the word of Akbar Khan, son of the Afghan emir, that not a single hair on their heads would be touched. Every single one of them was dead, frozen in mountain passes, shot from cliff tops, stabbed in the dark, starved in the snow. 16,500 people reduced in 7 days to one half-dead surgeon on a dying horse.
And here is what makes this story different from every other military disaster in history.
The British had been warned. They had been told by their own officers, by their own intelligence, by Afghans who risked their lives to send word that the retreat was a trap, that the passes were already being fortified, that Akbar Khan's guarantee was worth nothing. They marched anyway. This is the story of the greatest military catastrophe in British imperial history. The event that made Afghanistan famous as the graveyard of empires. The 7 days in January 1842 that no British general, no Soviet commander, and no American strategist ever truly learned from. And it started, like all great disasters, not with a battle, but with a decision. To understand what happened in January 1842, you need to understand why 16,500 British and Indian soldiers were sitting in Kabul in the first place. The answer is fear. Not of Afghanistan, of Russia. In the 1830s, the British Empire controlled India, the most valuable colony in the world. Hundreds of millions of people, endless resources, cotton, spices, opium, silk. The entire British economy was built on the back of India, and the British knew it, and they were terrified of losing it. To the north, the Russian Empire was expanding. Every year, Russian armies pushed further south through Central Asia, absorbing khanates and kingdoms that had existed for centuries. Bukhara, Khiva, Samarkand. One by one, they fell. British strategists looked at a map and did the math. If Russia kept moving south, the next stop was Afghanistan. And if Russia controlled Afghanistan, Russia controlled the mountain passes into India. The Khyber Pass, the Bolan Pass, the Kurram Valley. Ancient roads that had been used by every conqueror from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan to reach the subcontinent. This fear had a name: the Great Game. The secret, decades-long competition between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia. Spies, diplomats, explorers, and soldiers playing chess with entire countries as their pieces. Afghanistan was the most important square on the board. In 1839, the British decided to stop playing chess and start playing checkers. Instead of diplomacy, they would send an army. They would remove the current Afghan ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan, who they suspected was negotiating with Russia, and replace him with a pro-British puppet king named Shah Shuja, a former ruler who had been living in comfortable exile in Ludhiana for 30 years. The plan looked simple on paper. March an army through the Bolan Pass, capture Kandahar, take Kabul, put Shah Shuja on the throne, leave a garrison to keep him there. Job done. And for a while, it actually worked. The British Army of the Indus, 21,000 strong, crossed into Afghanistan in the spring of 1839. They took Kandahar without a fight. They stormed the ancient fortress of Ghazni with a single night assault that cracked open the gates with a bag of gunpowder. They rode into Kabul in August 1839, installed Shah Shuja on the throne of Afghanistan, and declared victory. Back in London, there were medals, promotions, celebratory dinners. The newspapers called it a triumph of British power. Nobody listened to the officers who had actually been inside Afghanistan, the ones who had watched the faces of the Afghan tribesmen as the British columns marched past, the ones who understood that Afghanistan was not a country in the European sense, with a central government and a single army that you could defeat in one battle. It was a collection of fiercely independent tribes, mountain clans, and ancient blood feuds, held together by nothing except a shared hatred of foreign occupation. You could march into Afghanistan. Every conqueror from Alexander onwards had managed that. Getting out was the problem. By 1841, the British had been in Kabul for 2 years. The occupation had settled into an uneasy routine. Shah Shuja held court in the Bala Hisar, the ancient hilltop fortress that dominated the city, surrounded by British bayonets and Afghan courtiers who despised him equally. British officers patrolled the bazaars. Indian sepoys manned the checkpoints. The cantonment, the sprawling military camp built on the flat plain outside the city walls, had become almost comfortable. Too comfortable. This is one of the first things that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. The British cantonment at Kabul was built wrong. Catastrophically, inexplicably wrong. Military cantonments are supposed to be defensible. High walls, clear fields of fire, a secure location that can be held against attack. Standard doctrine that any junior officer learns in his first year of training. The Kabul cantonment had none of these things. It sat on low, flat ground, surrounded by hills and orchards and villages that provided perfect cover for attackers. The walls were low and poorly constructed. There was no reliable water supply inside the perimeter. The ammunition and supply stores were located in a separate fort outside the main cantonment walls, which meant that in any attack, the garrison would have to send men outside under fire just to get their own bullets.
British engineers had pointed this out when the cantonment was first being planned. They had been ignored.
The commanding general was William George Keith Elphinstone, Major General, veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a man who had shown genuine courage at Waterloo nearly 30 years before. He was now 60 years old, crippled by gout so severe that he sometimes could not stand, had not commanded troops in combat for decades, and, by his own admission to colleagues, was in no physical condition to lead a military campaign. He had asked to be relieved of command before the situation deteriorated. His requests had been ignored. The British political officer in Kabul was Sir William Macnaghten. Brilliant, ambitious, deeply convinced that the Afghan occupation was going smoothly and almost completely wrong about everything. Macnaghten reported to London that Afghanistan was pacified, that Shah Shuja was popular, that the tribes had accepted British authority. His dispatches were filled with optimism that bore almost no relationship to what was actually happening in the streets and mountains around him. What was actually happening was that Afghanistan was preparing to explode. The subsidies that Britain had been paying to Afghan tribal leaders to keep them cooperative were being cut. London had decided the occupation was costing too much. The tribal leaders who had been bought off were now simply angry. Shah Shuja, the puppet king, was despised by nearly everyone in Afghanistan, seen as a traitor installed by infidels. And word had spread through every mountain village and desert town that the British garrison in Kabul was weak, poorly positioned, and led by a general who could barely walk. The match was struck on November 2nd, 1841. It started in the bazaar. A crowd gathered. Arguments turned to shouts. Shouts turned to violence. Within hours, the uprising had spread through the city. Afghan fighters attacked the house of the British political officer Alexander Burnes, one of the most capable and well-connected British officials in the country. They killed him in his courtyard. Then they went for the supply depot. That separate fort outside the cantonment walls, the one the engineers had warned about, the one holding the garrison's food, ammunition, and winter supplies. Afghan fighters seized it before the British could respond. In a single morning, the Kabul garrison lost most of its food and a significant portion of its ammunition without firing a shot. Elphinstone called a council of war. His officers argued. Some wanted to counterattack immediately, retake the supply fort, and crush the uprising before it spread. Others wanted to hold the cantonment and wait for reinforcements from Kandahar. Elphinstone did neither. He waited. He sent messages. He negotiated. He wrote letters. For 6 weeks, while the uprising intensified around them, while Afghan fighters occupied every hill overlooking the cantonment and sniped at British soldiers from the rooftops, while the food supplies dwindled and the temperature dropped toward the brutal Afghan winter, Elphinstone negotiated. The one British officer who wanted to fight was Brigadier John Shelton, and even he was compromised. In one engagement, he actually formed his troops into tight squares on open ground, the classic British defensive formation from the Napoleonic Wars, completely useless against Afghan mountain fighters who simply climbed above them and shot down into the formations from elevated positions. The British lost that engagement badly. They retreated back into the cantonment. By December, the situation was desperate. Food was running low. The soldiers were cold and hungry. Shah Shuja, the man they had come to put on the throne, had retreated entirely into the Bala Hissa fortress and showed no interest in helping his British patrons. Every attempt to break out of the cantonment or retake lost positions had failed. And then Macnaghten made the decision that sealed everyone's fate. He opened negotiations with Akbar Khan. Akbar Khan was the son of Dost Muhammad, the ruler the British had removed in 1839. He was charismatic, ruthless, intelligent, and he hated the British with a clarity of purpose that gave everything he did a kind of terrible focus. He had been one of the primary organizers of the November uprising. He was now the most powerful military force in the field around Kabul. He offered the British a deal: safe passage out of Afghanistan, all troops, all civilians, all camp followers. They would be allowed to march to Jalalabad, and from there, back to India. In exchange, the British would withdraw completely, leave Afghanistan to its own devices, and take Shah Shuja with them. Macnaghten, with no good options left, agreed. On December 23, 1841, Macnaghten rode out to meet Akbar Khan personally to finalize the terms. What happened next has been debated by historians for 180 years. By most accounts, Akbar Khan had Macnaghten seized. There was a struggle. Macnaghten was killed, his body dragged through the streets of Kabul and hung in the bazaar. The British political officer who had told London everything was fine in Afghanistan was dead. The agreement he had signed was in tatters, and 16,500 people were now trapped in a freezing cantonment with almost no food, almost no ammunition, and a general who could not walk.
Elphinstone kept negotiating. Even after Macnaghten's murder, even as his officers begged him to fight their way out, to occupy the Bala Hissa fortress with its thick walls and commanding position, to do anything except wait passively while the situation deteriorated further. He negotiated a new agreement with Akbar Khan, and on January 6, 1842, they marched. 16,500 people walked out of the Kabul cantonment gates and into the snow. British and Indian soldiers, officers' wives, children, servants, merchants who had followed the army, camp followers who had nowhere else to go. They moved slowly, burdened by baggage, struggling through snowdrifts that reached the knees of the men and the waists of the women. The temperature was well below freezing. The men's water had frozen in their canteens before they had marched 2 miles. The safe passage that Akbar Khan had promised lasted approximately 4 hours. At the Khord Kabul Pass, 12 miles from the city, Afghan fighters opened fire from the cliff tops above the column. There was no warning, no ultimatum. One moment, the column was moving in cold, exhausted silence. The next, bullets and rocks were pouring down from above, and men were falling in the snow. The column had no high ground, no cover, no way to return effective fire against shooters positioned hundreds of feet above them. They could only keep moving or die where they stood. They kept moving. By the end of the first day, several hundred people were dead. That night, they camped in the open. No shelter, no fires large enough to matter against the Afghan winter. The temperature dropped to -10, -15. Day 2 was worse. The column had stretched out for miles, the strongest moving ahead, the wounded and frostbitten falling behind. Afghan fighters shadowed them on every ridgeline, picking off stragglers, cutting off parties that fell too far behind the main body. The baggage was abandoned, piece by piece. Then the baggage animals. Then the wounded who could not walk. Akbar Khan appeared in person, riding along the column, supposedly to enforce the safe passage his fighters were openly violating. He offered to take the British women and children under his personal protection, to escort them separately. Elphinstone, with no ability to protect them himself, agreed. The women and children were taken. They would survive the retreat, held as hostages, and eventually ransomed. The soldiers were not so fortunate. By the third day, the column had ceased to exist as a military formation. It was a mob. Thousands of starving, frostbitten, terrified people, stumbling through mountain passes under constant fire, leaderless, without food or ammunition, or any coherent plan. Elphinstone himself was captured by Akbar Khan on day 4, taken supposedly for his own protection. He died in captivity 3 months later. The remnants of the column reached the Gandamak Pass on January 13th. Approximately 200 soldiers remained, mostly from the 44th Regiment of Foot. They had no ammunition left, except for a handful of rounds per man. They were surrounded. An Afghan commander offered them terms: surrender, give up their weapons, and they would be spared. The soldiers of the 44th looked at each other. They fixed their bayonets. Every one of them died at Gandamak, fighting with empty muskets and bare steel until they were overwhelmed. A handful were taken prisoner in the final moments. The rest were killed where they stood. And Dr. William Bryden, who had survived by luck, and the fact that a piece of a Blackwoods magazine stuffed inside his cap stopped a sword blow that would have split his skull, rode on alone through the final miles to Jalalabad. When the garrison at Jalalabad heard that a relief column might be coming, they had begun sounding a bugle every hour, sending the call out across the plains so that any survivor within earshot could follow the sound to safety. For days they sounded the bugle, and for days no one came. Then, on January 13th, a single figure appeared on the horizon.
The news of the Kabul disaster reached London in February 1842. The reaction was unlike anything the British public had experienced since Napoleon. 16,500 people. Gone. Not defeated in battle, not captured, not scattered. Annihilated. Erased. An entire army, with all its camp followers and civilians, wiped from existence in 7 days in the mountains of a country that Britain had confidently declared pacified just 2 years earlier. The British government's first instinct was revenge. A new army of retribution was assembled under General George Pollock, a competent officer who was everything Elphinstone was not. Healthy, aggressive, experienced in mountain warfare. He forced the Khyber Pass in April 1842, reached Kabul in September, burned the covered bazaar of the city to the ground as punishment, and rescued the British prisoners that Akbar Khan still held. Then he marched back to India. Because here was the lesson that the Army of Retribution confirmed. The lesson that every force in Afghanistan has had to learn for itself. You can get in, you can do damage, you can get back out, but you cannot stay. Afghanistan swallows armies that try to stay. The prisoners were freed, the bazaar was burned, and then the British left Afghanistan exactly as empty-handed as they had arrived, except for 16,500 fewer people. Shah Shuja, the puppet king they had died to put on the throne, had been assassinated just months after the retreat, killed by his own Afghan courtiers. Dost Muhammad Khan, the ruler they had removed in 1839, was released from exile and restored to power in Kabul. Everything Britain had spent, every life lost, every rupee of treasury money, every political capital expended, it had all returned to exactly where it started, except for the dead. The official inquiry was a masterpiece of institutional self-protection. Elphinstone was dead, which was convenient. Macnaghten was dead. Most of the senior officers who might have explained what happened were dead. The inquiry found errors of judgment, failures of planning, failures of intelligence. It found no one still alive to blame.
If this story kept you watching, subscribe and drop a comment. Comment. What moment hit you hardest?
The Gandamak last stand? Elphinstone's incompetence? Or the fact that every empire did this twice?